Okay, good afternoon, good morning, good evening, wherever you are. And a very warm welcome to the third seminar of APSA's series of seminars for 2023. My name is Pius Chong, and I'm the co-convener of APSA. COVID has transformed the world of connectivity. With technology, we're able to simultaneously interact physically and virtually. We are glad that so many of you are able to join us today. We have over 200 registrants for today's seminar, including about 60 here today physically in the room, and the rest online. Once again, I welcome you to today's seminar, the topic of which is the Hong Kong SARs and mainland China's interconnections with the global financial system. First, I would like to invite Susie Chung, co-convener of APSA, who will spend a few minutes to update you about what APSA has been doing as an industry association. Susie, please.
Okay. It's okay. Thank you. Can you all hear me? Good. First of all, a very warm welcome to all those who have made time to attend our seminar today in person. It really is a great effort on your part, and we truly appreciate your presence today. Now, Tony is going to, the title of Tony's talk today is on the HKSARs and the mainland's interconnections with global system. The subject of his talk is of topical interest in light of the US-China political tensions, which are having a huge impact on global political and economic stability. A recent report published by the IMF in April this year says that global tensions could disrupt overseas investment and eventually lead to a long-term loss of 2% of the world's GDP. Then again, the IMF report, however, did not take into account the very recent Israel-Palestine conflict that erupted on 7th October last month, and which has raised alarm across the world. Thus, the subject of the talk by Tony today is timing. Now, I just want to spend 1 to 2 minutes just on APSA. In recent years, APSA has turned its focus to helping promote Hong Kong as a securitization financing hub by advocating to facilitate the building of mainland's cross-border securitization and using Hong Kong as the financing platform. Well, the reason for our initiative is simple. After less than a decade since resuming securitization activity in 2014, mainland China has become the second largest structured finance market in the world after the US, with an annual issuance averaging 355 billion US over the past 5 years. And the outstanding balance of securities was about 670 billion US at end 2022. These are no small figures. Well, notwithstanding the size of mainland China's securitization market, it remains largely a domestic market, with both the underlying collateral and bonds denominated in renminbi. To bolster Hong Kong's position as an IFC and help promote Hong Kong's development as a debt capital market in the Asia-Pacific region, APSA is advocating for the introduction of facilitative channels riding on the Connect schemes, which would enable issuers of the China asset-backed securities to have their notes listed on the Hong Kong Stock Exchange for purchase by global investors. The initiative is also consistent with the mainland central government's policy, which is to encourage greater foreign capital investment in mainland China's economy. Such an initiative to help develop the structured finance market in Hong Kong is not dissimilar to the bold measure taken by the market and the Hong Kong government back in 1993 by introducing the listing of Qingdao beer on the HKEX. Lastly, I would say the availability and listing of a critical mass of the mainland's ABS in Hong Kong could act as an anchor to attract issuers from the Middle East and the ASEAN to have their asset-backed securities listed on the HKEX by way of fundraising. Such development could help develop Hong Kong as a securitization financing hub and confer potentially huge benefits to Hong Kong's economy and its financial professionals. APSA is presently liaising with the regulators in the mainland and Hong Kong to facilitate the adoption of the initiative. Going forward, we will also work together with other industry associations to acquaint them with what securitization is all about and how best to equip themselves with the necessary skills to play an important role in the market's development. On this note, may I urge you to support APSA and its endeavors going forward. Thank you very much. I hand over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Susie. Before I introduce Dr. Neoh, I wish to acknowledge the support of Bank of China, Hong Kong, and also CICC as today's event sponsors. Also, I wish to thank KPMG as our venue sponsor. I'm privileged and honored to introduce Dr. Anthony Neoh, Senior Advisor to APSA, who needs little introduction. Dr. Neoh is a senior lawyer, bank director, and former financial regulator. His eminence and unparalleled experience are reasons we are here today to learn and gain insights from him amidst the challenges of geopolitical events that are deeply dividing the world. What will these trends bring to Hong Kong's future as an international financial center? How will Hong Kong's interconnections with the mainland play into a world beset by these geopolitical divisions? Will there be one or more global financial systems in the future? How can financial professionals best prepare themselves for such a future? Dr. Neoh will analyze these issues from their historical roots to the present day, from his experience of the past 30 years in the financial and legal worlds. It gives me great pleasure to present to you Dr. Neoh. Please welcome him to the podium. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Pius, and so very nice to see so many old friends around the room, and thank you for those watching online. Before I start, I thought I make I give you two stories, basically. The first story is something which explains why I appear to be a bit slow today. because this morning I went for a CT scan, and the doctors, in fact, gave me free pills. The reason for which is to slow down my heart rate. Otherwise, they couldn't take a clear picture, apparently. So my heart rate has been slowed down from the usual 89 beats a second to now 65 beats a second. So I would appear a bit slow to you. You have to bear with me today. The other thing is that I've been wearing this poppy, and many people, why are you wearing this little red flower? Well, let me explain why. When I was a young boy, my mom used to tell me that, Tony, you were very, very lucky to have been born in 1946, because if the war had continued, you either wouldn't have been born or other you have suffered very much. And which is why I wear this every year, to honor the people who gave their lives, or in fact their health, so that I could be spared the deprivations of war. So I wear this with honor and with great gratitude. Now, let me explain why I've been asked to give this lecture. I've been thinking about this for quite some time. Because as a bank director and chair of risk of ICBC, and also as a director, and Vernon knows this, of CITIC, which is a global conglomerate. And I sit on the risk and audit committee. And we have to try and fathom what the world is like today. Where are we going? Where is China going? Both of us are, ICBC works in 49 countries with subsidiaries and branches, and 180 countries with connections around the world. So we have to know. But one of the big problems about trying to know is that at the moment, there's hell of a lot of information about the world. In fact, there's an information explosion. You go through the website, you go through Bing, you go through ChatGPT, or ChatGPT 5 now, not 4, basically, and you get hell of a lot of stuff, basically. And how do you know what's wrong, what's right, and what's wrong, what's false or what's true? And this is the problem which is facing us. But let me then start with this. Let me see, how do I work this? Do I have the second slide? This doesn't work with me. Can I have the second slide, please? Yeah. This doesn't work at the moment. Okay. Okay, right. It's working. It's working. I got it. I'd like to start with this large panel of issues for you. It's a very large panel, but I thought I'd just go a little bit before then to the pre-Second World War, to the pre-Second World War years, what is known in the history books as the post-war years. And well, I'm not going to go through all of that because that's going to take too much time. But there were really 3 things I thought that we ought to understand from what has come out of these pre-war years. The first thing was that everybody gave up the gold standard except the US. And that actually was the most important thing which has happened to the post-war world. That's the first thing. The second thing that has happened was that in the US, they passed an act, I forgot it's Halls-Crowley Act, I think. And that act was in effect much worse than Trump could ever conceive, actually, in terms of trade embargoes and trade tariffs. And that was because basically what has happened at the time was that a lot of money was being repatriated into America because of the troubles around Europe and in Asia. Everybody was selling stuff and then bringing the money back to the US. There's just too much money, basically, but not enough gold, basically. And the central banks in Europe were trying to withdraw gold. In fact, the Bank of England gave up the gold standard because France was drawing nearly all the gold that they had. And as a result, they gave up. And France, of course, then everybody then going to France and asking them for the gold. And therefore, they gave up the gold standard. So everybody gave up the gold standard. And in the end, people asked Roosevelt, who was elected in late 1931. He was, you remember his speech in January 1932, when he said that you have nothing to fear but fear itself. That's what he said, right? Well, he didn't know what the hell he was talking about, basically, because he had troubles up to his neck, basically. There's tremendous. This New Deal basically didn't actually save the US. There was still the Dust Bowl. There was still a lot of unemployment. And what really saved him in the end was his entry into the Second World War. And we'll come to that in a moment. So that's the first thing. The second thing was the trade embargoes and the tariffs. Now, the third thing was actually a groundswell of economic theory at the time. The economic theory at that time was very much classical, which is that, demand and supply, they'll find an equilibrium. Somehow, the prices, the market will fix itself. That was the belief, and that was the mantra at the time. Well, John Maynard Keynes came in and said, this is ridiculous, basically, because if you wait for the equilibrium, that is in the long term. And in the long term, we're all dead. That is his famous phrase, actually, in the long term, we are all dead. And he came out with, of course, the general theory, which essentially was what we now call Keynesian theory, or what we call fiscal policy today. But those are the three things. But if you like to read the general theory, it's actually not a difficult book to read. It is actually the easiest book on macroeconomics that you could find in the market today. Every other book, in fact, is full of mathematical formulas. This book has very few, and well worth reading because it is so well written. But the other economics work that he wrote, which is prophetic, was after the Versailles Conference in 1919. He disagreed with the powers at the time, and he wrote this pamphlet, which is one of the best writings that you could find in the English language. In fact, even comparing that to Churchill's, it's called The Economic Consequences of the Peace. That is a really good piece of English prose writing. And if you really like English prose writing, that is the pamphlet to read. But anyway, so those are the three things. There's the theory, trade closure in essence, and the third thing, gold standard. Only US had the gold standard. Fast forward to World War II. Now, in the World War II, then we have what is known as the post-World War order. And that is the post-World War order that we have. Well, don't think that this sort of appeared immediately after the Second World War. It didn't appear like that. You see, in 1941, a group of people in the US State Department was beginning to fashion all of these things in 1941, right after Pearl Harbor. Roosevelt had different groups of people advising him. And one of those groups then came forward and said, well, we're going to enter the war now, but what are we going to do after the war? So they began to work, in fact, in some basement, somewhere in one of the avenues. I don't know which one. It's probably the basement of the Treasury Department. And only a few people, it grew and grew and grew. And right after the war, after August 1945, they called the first thing, which was the San Francisco Conference. And the San Francisco Conference, of course, was the organization of the United Nations. Interestingly enough, in the San Francisco Conference, Zhou Enlai, as well as Chiang Kai-shek, was invited, actually, because the United States couldn't decide, in fact, who was going to run China. Both of them actually were invited to the San Francisco Conference. But of course, by 1947, when it was when the United Nations was formed at the time, Chiang Kai-shek became the leader of China. The United States recognized Chiang Kai-shek as the leader against the advice of many people. Actually, it was Roosevelt's decision at the time. That was just before he died, actually. He died very soon afterwards. And just before he died, he made that fateful decision that Chiang Kai-shek's government is going to run China, despite the fact that he was losing all kinds of battles 47 was the time when he was sort of losing, not exactly losing. 48 and 49, that was the time when the whole thing began to fall. But 47, at that time, it was sort of 60-40, basically, sort of situation. So therefore, but the United Nations was based on important principles. It was based on principles which was decided by the European governments in 1648 in Westphalia. It was after a lot of these religious wars. And those principles are very simple, that if you are a nation state, you have a right to sovereignty. You have a right not to be attacked. You have a right to make your own decisions. Those are the three important things in the Westphalian principles. Now that was in the charter, which is why we, as a government, always go back to the charter of the United Nations. Now then, you would then ask the next question is, why does Antony Blinken always say that you guys are not observing the international rule-based order? He always says that. Now, what does that mean? He never explained that. But in fact, it all goes back to what has happened right after the Second World War. Because the international rule-based order was based on, in fact, a series of things which the US created internationally after the war. Now why did, and you can see that all of these meetings, the UN meeting was held in San Francisco, the International Monetary Fund was held in Bretton Woods, which is somewhere in New Hampshire. The World Bank meeting was also held there. The only meeting which wasn't held was in Geneva, which was the GATT agreement. They wanted to organize the WTO at the time. And but then there was not enough votes to organize the WTO. So they opt for the second best, which was the General Agreement on Trade and Tariffs. Now, so that was the international sort of rule-based order that the US created. And Blinken, of course, is a student of diplomatic history. And as are most of the State Department people. And therefore, really, I think that is what they meant. But though they never explained it, because that was a creation, and it was not a bad thing at the time. It was built with, I think, lofty objectives. And the first lofty objective was the Westphalian principle. The second lofty objective was that really the International Monetary Fund should be based, in fact, on equality of membership. But unfortunately, it didn't end that way. It did not end that way for two things. The first is that John Maynard Keynes was then the two towering figures which went into the Bretton Woods conference at the time was Henry Dexter, which is the US Treasury representative. I don't know whether he was a secretary at the time. He was a representative anyway. And the UK representative was John Maynard Keynes, who was then quite ill, actually. He died very soon afterwards, actually. And he joined. Now, John Maynard Keynes suggested that because of this principle of sovereignty and equality, we should have an international currency, which is not based on anybody's currency. It should be based on, in fact, a combination of the economic strengths of each of these countries, and then change over time to reflect that. And therefore, he called this, in fact, the thing called the Bancor, B-A-N-C-O-R. He called this the Bancor, actually, which is very, very interesting. Well, obviously, then everybody then asked, if that's a Bancor, then who's going to set the value of the Bancor, basically? And then John Maynard says, of course, we do this by vote in the IMF. Everybody has a vote. And then the US then said, well, we are the country with the biggest GDP. We should have the biggest vote right now. And everybody's, GDP is shot to pieces after the war. You have no GDP. We nearly have 100% of the GDP. You guys have next to zero. So therefore, I call the shots. Then they came back and said, oh my God, I don't like that. Okay. And then Henry Dexter then came in and said, why not use gold, he says, and the US dollar. He says, we promised the world in 1934 that if you have 35 US dollars, it's going to change it for 1 troy ounce of 99.99% gold. So Henry Dexter won, essentially. So we didn't have the Bangkok at that time. So those are and the other thing which he won was basically the voting by way of contribution to the economy of the world, and contribution, in fact, to the IMF's coffers. Now, the same thing happened with the World Bank. The same thing happened, which is why the US has the biggest vote in the World Bank because of its largest, which is why in the World Bank, you always have a US nominee. Now, the IMF is actually a subsidiary of the World Bank, incidentally. Which is why it's sort of just one street away. And therefore, the IMF head is called a managing director of the World Bank. Now, and the deal which was done at the time with the European powers was that, well, the US will always nominate the president of the World Bank, and the Europeans will nominate the managing director of IMF. So all the developing countries got no say in all of that. It's always been the developing countries at the time, up to today, incidentally. And what's happened also then is that, well, this US dollar thing has gone on for too long. And of course, we all know that the US then decided in 1971 to say, to hell with you guys, basically, and we're not gonna give you 1 ounce of gold for $35 US. We're going to stop that. But they basically had a moratorium for 3 years up to 1974, only for central banks. And as a result of that, France withdrew all of its gold, incidentally, from the US. They sent a warship to the US to withdraw all the gold. They got more or less, I think, the gold's time. And the gold didn't like the US at the time. And he sent the warship, brought all the gold back to Paris, which is why there's not an ounce of French gold in the US right now. But in 2011, Zhou Xiaochuan, who was the governor of the People's Bank of China, in an IMF meeting, and his speech was very short, and you find this in Google or in English. And he said it's time really to review, in fact, the status of the developing countries. We shouldn't actually ask only the developing country, and essentially the developing country means only one country, dictating, in fact, the economic rules of the world. And we should then decide to go back to the Bangkok. Now, it was then decided that in the special drawing rights, China should become a part of it. Prior to 2011, China was not part of the special drawing rights of the IMF. China then very soon later on became a part of the special drawing rights, which basically gave a voice to China as a developing and large economy. But that was the narrative which went back to 2011. So essentially what we have was really a set of rules which were built by the Americans, I think to a certain extent, and I would not want to ascribe any kind of sort of, adverse motives to them. I think those are the people who try to do this with a set of lofty objectives, which is equality. And the objective of equality essentially worked its way through the GATT, the General Agreement on Trade and Tariffs, because that was the area which actually promoted, in fact, the growth of the world because of that. And which is why we see, in fact, throughout 1947, all the way to 1986, there were so many rounds of discussion, which created, in fact, a really, I think, a groundswell of reduction in tariffs. And as a result, in fact, you'll find a tremendous growth of trade. And let me then show you that growth of trade here. And before the formation of the WTO, I'll come back to that in a moment, you'll find that the trade of the world actually increased tremendously from 1968 onwards, all the way up now to this graph. Big increase. Now, why did it increase in 1968? That's the important question. Why? Question in 1968. The question was this: in the Articles of Agreement, in the original Article of Agreement of the IMF, you didn't have to give a timetable as to when you would make your currency exchangeable. In other words, when you would demolish your exchange controls. In Article 8 of that, there's no timetable. But Article 8 was changed in 1968 to say that all members of the IDF will not have exchange controls for trade. Only for trade, incidentally, all right? They can have exchange controls for investment and for capital flows arising from investment. As far as trade is concerned, now the reason why trade is given this exception was, of course, the importance of trade for the world. The other thing is this, is in terms of trade, you know, you guys, some of your lawyers are in banking and so on, okay? You know, trade is that it's always delivery upon payment, basically. You know, in the old days, you give me one widget, I give you a piece of gold or whatever, and that's it. Now, even in older days, you have delayed payment, but nonetheless, the delay is not going to be very long, which is why you don't need to have these delayed flows. And as a result, you can actually control this relatively easily. You know, you give them goods, you get money, you pay money, you get goods, basically. And that is the reason why in 1968, the Article 8 of the Articles of Agreement was changed. And because of this change, it allowed trade to really go forward around the world. And by 67, you've seen the various rounds. And these rounds went all the way to 87. They got more and more difficult because they went into more and more difficult subjects. And really, originally, the most difficult subject of trade at that time was actually the question of cheap labor, making cheap clothing, selling to developing countries. And the developing countries were about the only countries which could actually have the labor to collect cotton and make textiles. And as a result, because it's all labor-intensive stuff. And as a result of that, the developing countries will say, oh my God, you know, you got these cheap people coming. And the GATT rule says that, well, you know, are you in fact now flooding my markets with cheap goods that you underprice and so on. So as a result of that, they had a thing called the multi-fiber agreement, which is actually an exception to the rules of the GATT. There was an exception. The multi-fiber agreement was actually a very long agreement. But I still remember as an admin officer, you know, I had to deal with that from time to time. And I'm sure Andrew must have done with it from time to time as well. Were you in Trade Department, Andrew? You were the Director of Trade, were you not? At some stage. Yes? No, you know this well, yeah. Now, and as a result of all of that, every country were given quotas under the MFA. And still as a young lawyer, when I first started, I was litigating about people buying and selling quotas because you don't have to sell the clothing because the quota was actually sometimes more expensive than the clothing. And the MFA went on for a very, very long time until the WTO then got formed in 1998. Then the MFA then went, basically, because the world has changed by that time. Because then you have, you know, people like very high quality clothing and so on. It was selling fashion stuff and so on. And therefore, the developing countries felt they could control the situation. So the MFA went. Now, which is why you will find that from about the late 1990s onwards, you get another big spike up. And that was the formation of the WTO. Now, China joined the WTO in 2002, right now. So again, China again benefited from that. So I think we can all say that we were, and everybody was a beneficiary to the so-called, in fact, rules-based, international rule-based order, as understood, in fact, by a proper reading of the WTO, and as understood by a proper reading of the Articles of Association, of Agreement of the IMF, and the Constitution of the World Bank, by proper reading. I mean, but who does the proper reading? That's the question on this. Nobody does it. And as a result, of course, we take different positions on this. And this is where we are now at the moment. Now, then I would like to take you on to then, as a result of the changes of trade, there's a tremendous amount of extension. But then the great expansion of trade right up to the year 2020, in fact, has created problems of its own. The problems of its own was that created a very difficult balance of payment deficit for the importing countries. Because in the importing countries, they pay money, basically, for goods that they import, basically. So all the money goes out of the country. That's the other thing. And therefore, you have a tremendous sort of balance of payments deficit. It's always like that, in fact. And this is the question, that you cannot have your cake and eat it. They had the cake, basically, because of the world currency. The other thing, of course, is there were currency misalignments already at the time. And you will recall that in 1971, the US dollar, of course, then went into free float with 3 years of moratorium for central banks. And in 1974, it went into complete free float at that time. And what has happened at the country, free float at that time, more or less, was that the US, and it is in Kissinger's memoirs, incidentally. So the guy who did it admitted it. He was sent to all the Middle Eastern countries, the oil-producing Middle Eastern countries at the time by Nixon. And that was before Iran became totally Islamic. Basically, the Shah was running Iran at the time. And Kissinger then said to them, well, in future, if you sell oil, you must always get US dollars, nothing else. And if you don't do that, we're not going to protect you against Israel. Now, what has happened is this. It's 1974, all right? Remember the year, 1974, okay? In 1973, there was a Yom Kippur War between Israel and Lebanon and Syria, and all the countries aligned against Syria. We're getting into something like that right now, but it happened. What has happened? That Israel nearly got trounced, nearly. It was a very dangerous thing for Israel at the time, and in the end, it was U.S. intervention, which actually then separated the parties and said, you guys don't fight. So, which is why the promise by Kissinger to the oil-producing countries was worth something at that time. And they said, yes, we'll do it. Which is why, until very, very recently, the last 3 years, we've always had petrodollars. That's the other thing. Now, by 1974, something has also happened, which is this. Something that happened in the interwar years, about 1934, when the Glass-Steagall Act was enacted by the U.S. Congress, and that was one of the part of Roosevelt's New Deal, the Glass-Steagall Act. Now, the Glass-Steagall Act was that it does a number of things. The Glass-Steagall Act actually, it does one thing is that banks cannot do underwriting of securities. Now, that's the thing that most people remember, but it does something much more than that. Actually, it created a thing. It gives the U.S. Federal Reserve the power to control interest rates. Control, incidentally, not by market operations, but control, incidentally, which means that there's a thing called Regulation Q in the US, which says this, that no banks can actually accept deposits higher than the rate pronounced by the Fed under Regulation Q. So people then said that, well, I get 2% in the US and Europe and London, I get 3%, 4%, I send my money to Europe, basically. It is as simple as that. Of course, before the Second World War, Europe was in such turmoil that didn't matter, basically. But after the war, when Europe began to rebuild in the 60s and 70s, when Europe began to rebuild, and the US then was losing, in fact, its gold guarantee, well, Regulation Q is just ridiculous at that time. And as a result, in fact, most of the US dollars emigrated to Europe, which is why London became the biggest euro dollar market. It still is actually the biggest euro-dollar market in the world. Now, because of that, we have a world which essentially is interconnected by the US dollar, not only by way of just the US Fed or the domestic economy of the United States, but now the external economy in all of Europe and the external economy of the oil-producing countries and the people who buy from these oil-producing countries, because you cannot buy stuff from them if you didn't have US dollars. So therefore, you have this complete interconnectivity between the US dollar and the rest of the world, which made, in fact, what Sarkozy as well as de Gaulle was the first person who said this, is that the United States dollar has exorbitant privilege. That was, it was said, it was de Gaulle who first said it. And then Sarkozy repeated it, basically. So again, it does have exorbitant privilege because of the interconnectivity around the world. So what we have today, therefore, is this misalignment of currencies, which is this, is that because of the US interconnectivity around the world, people are tied to the US dollar. They become prisoners of the US dollar as a result of it. And I'll show you more of that in a moment. But at the same time, they can't get out of their own economies. This is exactly what has happened with the South American economies. That is exactly what has happened to Argentina, particularly to Argentina. Brazil is a bit better because it has a lot of produce. Mexico is better because it had what is known as the NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement. Because of that, it was producing cheap stuff for the US, basically. But the US companies were actually producing the stuff in Mexico. It's not Mexicans owners, it's US owners who are actually doing that now. And China is trying to muscle in actually some of our state-owned enterprises trying to set up stuff in Mexico. And then the US say, no way we're going to allow that. We're going to allow our Mexican friends in NAFTA to do that. And we saw the opportunity, but we couldn't get it, basically. So which is why we have the misalignment. And as a result, we have a lot of these free trade agreements. We saw NAFTA. NAFTA worked very well. And as a result, there's now a whole plethora of this free trade agreements. You go to this website, you'll find it, basically. It's a hell of a lot of these. Even Hong Kong. Hong Kong has 16 of these at the moment with various countries. China has far more than that. And this therefore explains why there is this US-China trade war. The US is essentially finding that it's global interconnectivity, which allows it, in effect, to call the tune because of the rule-based international order created by it and interpreted by it, has gone somewhat awry because of the pushback, which is coming through the developing countries, the pushback which is coming through China, and so on. Even the Europeans have some pushback on this. And as a result, the US now are now reassessing their position, which is now they're behaving at the moment, in my view, irrationally, in their view, obviously rationally, otherwise they wouldn't have done it. Right now, recently, in fact, just 2 days ago, the US decided to put in 130 more sanctions against Russia. Now, the good that it would do would be very little actually for the US. I mean, the Russia has found ways around it already. So therefore, we have this war. Now, let me then go on to some of the evidence. The evidence, you can see that the US balance, current balance of payments, gone negative actually for a very, very long time, since the 1990s. It's been negative for that. It was negative already in the 1980s, but then what has happened was that Bill Clinton came into power, actually. Now, interestingly, you thought that a Democratic president wouldn't do much for the economy, but he was the only president who did something for the economy, incidentally. And what he has done is that he has balanced the budget at least for 2 years. No president has done that, actually, after the Second World War, actually. And he's balanced the budget for 2 years, which is quite a feat, incidentally. And he was able, in fact, to create a lot of exports of the US because of liberal trade policies that he did. And as a result, the balance of payments sort of came back somewhat. Now, that after he was deposed by the senior Bush, then it all went down again. Now, again, public policy has a part to play in all of this, but we can see that it all went down quite a lot. And this is the, it's not a pretty picture. You'll find that, the PRC, on the other hand, has really since 2017, in fact, somewhat decreased its balance of payment surplus, somewhat decreased the surplus. Again, because of pressures, but not only because of pressures, actually, there's another reason. We have been exporting a lot of primary goods, in other words, raw goods, or raw materials. We've been exporting a lot of that. But since the late 90s, the beginning of the 21st century, we have been producing what is now called in the trade as intermediate goods. In other words, goods that already made in some part. The reason why you don't make the complete goods at the moment is that various countries have what is known as certificates of origin in terms of manufacture because of tariff arrangements still around the world. So they make the intermediate goods to comply with the certificates of origin of each of these countries who put the whole stuff together and sell it as if it was their own stuff, basically. Now, and as a result, we have toned down our surplus. Because having toned down our surplus, actually, our currency actually went up somewhat. But nonetheless, that has happened. We have actually toned down. The Americans will say that, we did it because of pressure from them. There was some part of it, but in most part, some of my economist friends say that we really were very good at making intermediate goods from now on. So we basically don't need to do raw materials. In other words, in the old days, we would send goods by other people. We then put them all together and send them back. Now we still do that in a large way for Apple at the moment. But then that was very high-tech stuff, basically. But most stuff now, we can make the whole thing. Now it is said that, well, you look at the C-919, this is the airplane, okay? This is the wide-body airplane. Only 60% of the stuff in that plane is made in China. And said, that's not good enough. You should have 100% made in China. But the guys who said this don't know what they're talking about. Because you look at Airbus. Airbus, only 30% of the materials in Airbus is made in France. 70% is from global supply chain. And the real technology is not in actually making the stuff which goes into the plane, is making the plane. Actually putting all this stuff together and making the plane. And which is why now we have been achieving that. In fact, now for about 3 years, and one of the only 3 countries in the world that can make large-bodied airplanes. Brazil, Canada can make some airplanes, Bombardier, Embraer, and so on. They make some stuff, but then they don't make these big planes. These big planes are another kettle of fish, basically. And we're now making the 929. And we're now making, in fact, our own engines, basically. So again, this is the story which is now bugging, in fact, the country, which actually has created the international rule-based order that the whole world has somewhat benefited from it, but then which they control. Now they're coming back. Now let me tell you another story, which is this, is that if you look at the MSCI weighting around the world, okay? The MSCI weighting, this is world MSCI. For those who know the MSCI, you know what I'm talking about. Now, the world MSCI, in fact, has 100% weighting for different countries and for different stocks, basically. And what they've done is the most recent MSCI weighting. I think the most recent came out about June this year. What it says is that 69.7% of the weighting goes to the US market. 69.7%, okay? Something like 14% goes to the European market. The rest of the world is like another 13% or something like 13 or 16%, rest of the world. That's it. China is not even mentioned in that, incidentally. Europe, the UK is mentioned. The UK's got like 2.8% of the European 14%. China is not even mentioned. The rest of the world, basically. Now then, the most important piece of information from the MSCI weighting is this. You look at, well, what are the stocks that actually make up the biggest part of the MSCI building? There are only 10 stocks. 10 stocks make up 20% of the entire world weighting, and they're all in the US. They are Apple, Tesla, various other stocks. You can look it up in Google. MSCI weighting, 2023. You see that? And as a result, you can see that why the US is worried. Because it's got the largest capital market. Yes, it has, in fact, a big deficit in terms of its balance of payments. But all the money in the world comes back to them in terms of the 70% of the capital market. And they have the top markets, the top companies in the world that take up 20% of the MSCI weighting. Now, if you sit in that position, what would you be thinking? Well, I'd like to keep it forever, for sure, right? I don't blame them for doing that. That is a very rational way of looking at things. Now, because of this, they are worried. But then, being worried is one thing. Being able to determine the policies to keep it going is another. And that is the question, which is why I take you to the next step of this evidence. Now, the next step of the evidence is this, is that, okay, you know, they have been trying to really sanction Russia, making life difficult for the Russians and so on. Well, actually, they didn't make life difficult for the Russians. They made life pretty damn well for the Russians, actually. I don't know why, but anyway, why? Well, actually, I do know why, and tell you why it is. It is very, very simple. It is because Russia is the largest food and energy producer in one single country in the world. One single country in the world. And which is why the US in the last 3 days has actually put a sanction on Arctic 2 and Arctic 1. Why? Because they know that, because they already put a sanction on Nord Stream 1 and Nord Stream 2. In fact, it was said that they exploded Nord Stream 2, but who the hell knows? Nord Stream 1, I mean, who the hell knows? I mean, they said they didn't do it. Well, actually, didn't quite say they didn't do it. They said, I would not comment on it. They said, yeah. But anyhow, so now why are they putting a sanction on Arctic 2? But Arctic 1 and 2 are the two important LNG pipes that go to Japan and go to China. Those are the two. You put, you put a sanction on that, China is not going to care, basically, but Japan has to care. So what they have done is that poor Japan. I mean, if I were the prime minister of Japan and said, I'll immediately ring up Biden and said, what the hell are you trying to do to me? Because they are squeezing Japan because of this. Now, that's the reason why. And the other thing is, apart from Ukraine, which actually is one of the largest food producing countries in the world as well, actually, Russia is the other one. And a lot of Russian food goes to many countries around the world. And as a result, this is a country you cannot sanction, essentially. It's a country that you have to talk to. But then the public policy is the sanction policy, unfortunately, and which is why public policy has made this world not a better place, but a worse place, unfortunately. Now, then that is why the balance of payment in Russia is so good, because it's selling energy, it is selling food and so on to people. Now, the other thing is this, okay, you're selling food and so on. You only get rubles, right? If you want to buy stuff in US dollars, you can't do it. Easy. Well, what they do is that they go to Dubai, actually, and exchange some rubles for US dollars. But in fact, some of these guys don't even change the money for US dollars. They change the money for Bitcoin, which is why Bitcoin has got quite a bit of or Ethereum or whatever of these cryptocurrencies. I've known people who told me, well, I don't know the guy who actually bought the stuff. He told me that Ferraris and Lamborghinis and so on are bought in Bitcoin in Dubai. If you want to have a real Wild West pop market, you go to the Middle East, basically. Yeah. And lots of economic activity going on. It was like Hong Kong in the 60s and 70s, basically. If you want action, this is the place to go, basically. not Hong Kong right now. That's why Hong Kong is asking them, come here, please, come here. Share the action with us, you know. That's the reason why. And let me give you another piece of evidence now, in terms of global supply chains. In terms of global supply chains now, in fact, the intermediate goods and final goods, intermediate goods have now far outstripped final goods. Again, because of certificate of origin rules. The US, in fact, were tightening. And this is one of the reasons why the US labeled Hong Kong as being made in China. See? In the old days, we have a rule which says that if you have something which is made in Hong Kong, so long as, in fact, you know, you have half of it which would follow the rules, which is made in Hong Kong, you can put a label here as it's made in Hong Kong. But now you say, no, it's all made in China. Now we won the case, incidentally, in the WTO, but it didn't matter because the US is appealing and there's no appeal court in WTO because the US has refused, in fact, to nominate judges to the appeal court. So in fact, the whole thing is hanging right now. That's what the US do, rule-based international order that they made, basically. So that's one piece of evidence. Now, the other piece of evidence is that China still is one of the, right up to 2016, still the biggest importer to the US. Now, it has now become much less of an importer to the US, but still one of the biggest to the US, despite the sanctions, incidentally. So which is why we have the US always coming to see us. And I'll tell you there's another reason why in a moment. Hence, you see, the tariffs have dropped and so on. Let me then go into the growth of capital markets and see that now. Now, one of the big questions is this, is that all the developing countries are making widgets and making stuff. They're selling it to the US, but they got back US dollars. So the US dollars they've been able to use to buy stuff to grow the economies and so on. But there's always a surplus. And the saving rates in all of these countries are extremely high. In all developing countries, they're always extremely high. China has a household saving rate of as close as 30%. Sometimes at one stage it went to 40%. Now about 30%. Now because of that, there's money. And the money then goes to the US in the capital markets, which is why the US, because the capital markets in China is small. And sometimes it's hard to make money in the Chinese markets. Most people lose money, actually, in the Chinese capital markets, unfortunately. And as a result, they have to look farther afield. And there is this question of, you know, because we have a lot of people coming back from the US, these professors of finance, you see, come back from the US. They say, well, you know, you must understand portfolio theory. And this is a thing called asset allocation. And therefore, you actually have to ensure that you put eggs not in just one basket. You could put eggs in all kinds of baskets and so on. And as a result, the Chinese government had to do a thing called a QDII, which allows money actually to flow. And of course, a lot of state-owned enterprises, in fact, have lots and lots of money. In 1993, state-owned enterprises, in fact, listed in Hong Kong, they got a lot of money from their listings. They also have a lot of money from their overseas ventures as well as sales. Now the money has an intermediate stop. The money comes to Hong Kong, incidentally. And because of that, it's usually in US dollars. And as a result, they then do one of two things. They either buy up property in Hong Kong, and there's not a hell of a lot of that to buy, basically, in Hong Kong, and the prices go up very quickly at the time. And the other stuff that you could do is to invest in stock markets, and which is why you have people like, you know, Goldman Sachs, Morgan Stanley, JP Morgan, all of these guys are in Hong Kong right now. And they are actually doing stockbroking for a lot of our state-owned enterprises. And they've made a lot of money from it. Good for them. But there we are. That's the position. Which is why we have the growth of capital markets, very, very fast growth of capital markets around the world. Very, very fast. I'm going to run through this very quickly because it's something that's well known to you. Okay. So this is the capital markets which have grown very, very fast. And which is why Hong Kong and the Shanghai Stock Exchange, Shenzhen Stock Exchange, and Hong Kong Stock Exchange, they all figure in the top 10 stock markets of the world. But you have to be very careful about these figures. The first thing is that, well, if these are such big markets, how come they didn't actually take up more of the MSCI weighting? How come 70% of the weighting goes to the US and not come to these big stock markets? You have to ask yourself that question, right? Now, that question is easily answered in this way. It is because, in fact, the US markets are highly liquid. In fact, the stock exchange in Shenzhen, Shanghai, and Hong Kong, they are very liquid in relation to not more than 50 stocks, basically. And once you go through these 50 stocks, then it's a punt, basically. It's actually a gamble. Essentially, it's the way you buy. You could get a 10 cent in the future. You could, but it's a gamble. All right, it's a gamble. All right. So therefore, now if you are asset allocator and you are an alpha, long alpha fund manager, long alpha, I would say. So you have to look for the alpha in these very liquid stocks because your mandate requires you, in fact, to look at stock with certain liquidity. Without that liquidity, you're not allowed to do it, basically. That's the one thing. The other thing is that, okay, you're a hedge fund, okay? Then you can do whatever you like. But the problem about the hedge fund is that a lot of these stocks are not in the shorting list. You cannot do a long short. So therefore, you have to find the correlations in the indexes or in the options which are in the open market. Very little correlation. And if you want to do algo trading, well, you could do it in China, in Hong Kong. Well, you know, the two-way stamp duty is 0.26%. Right now, it's gone down to 0.20%. That's a hell of a lot of money for algo trading because of the speed that you have to go through. So people don't do it, basically. And this is the reason why 70% of the stocks go to US, or the money goes to US. It doesn't come to these countries despite the size. Now what explains the size of the stock market is the market cap. The market cap explains the size of these markets. They do have tremendous market cap. Actually, you'll find, in fact, all the major banks in China in top 10 Fortune 500 companies. But then, you know, they're in the stock market, but 70% is held by the government. 30% is out there in the markets, basically. And so therefore, you do not have the same liquidity as these 10 stocks as you have in the MSCI. So the US are less worried in terms of that, in terms of the capital markets. But what they are worried right now is not, in fact, the equity markets. What they are worried, in fact, is the bond market. And the reason is this. Let me then go through the evidence on that. In terms of financial bonds, the US, in fact, has the largest number of financial bonds. I only got BIS research up to 2021 at this stage. But there will be something coming up soon on 2022. But I don't think the situation's changed all that much. If anything, the US bonds have gone down a bit, actually. But you can see that the US bonds, essentially, in terms of, you see, the US is by far the largest. And government bonds make up most of the US bonds. Now, the reason why government bonds make up, and that is what they fear. Because it is US government bonds, treasury bonds, in other words, now have yields which are very high, basically, at the moment. You know, a 10-year bond at the moment is like 6% or something like this, you know. But then the bonds previous to that, with they have very, very low coupon rates, very low coupon rates because of the quantitative easing and so on and so forth. So you're losing money if you're actually using, you're losing money on your principal if you're selling these bonds right now. And that is what the US fears right now, is that people basically either shorting or selling their bonds. And this is the problem. And that's the reason why Yellen coming to China. You see, the Biden is going into election year next year. And he doesn't really want to have his officials coming almost like supplicants to China. You know, they have been called supplicants already, in fact, by the political opposition. Okay, you would lose no chance They're trying to basically sort of badmouth Biden because they want to get elected. And as a result, he has to do that despite, in fact, the political risk of doing that. The reason is that we have sold, in fact, in the last year or so, close to 100 billion of US treasuries. Now we hold about 800 billion US treasuries. We have to hold US treasuries because we have to settle in US dollars in many of our things. But we used to have at one stage close to 1.3 trillion US dollars in terms of US bonds. So now it's 800. Japan has actually sold in the last year, again, very close to 100 billion. And they have been told to stop. And I don't know why they would want to stop with now, the Arctic 2 sanction going on, squeezing them. But anyway, Japan is saying that, if I don't sell the US bonds, basically, I have no more money to actually keep my economy going. The other thing is this, is that I may well have to increase my interest rates a bit. If Japan increases the interest rates, money will come back from overseas because Japanese, in fact, are used to like negative interest rates. And if they can get 1%, they will come back. And the US treasuries, I don't know what's going to happen to US treasuries. If I were a hedge fund, I'd be beginning to short them, basically. Yeah. And that is their worry right now. And because of this worry, we can see that, let's go back to the other thing. Because of this worry, we find the world now in a very different place. The world is now highly unequal. You can see that, very unequal. The world is a very unequal world. Africa only takes up, you look at this, only takes up less than 3% of the wealth of the world. My God, it's got like 80% of the natural resources of the world. And it's only got 2.6%. How far have they been exploited? You can ask that question. And the Africans themselves are asking that question. So you see, therefore, the world is changing as a result of all of these questions which are being asked. Then you'll find that the share of people living on less than $2.5 million a day is actually very, very large. Well, we are very lucky in Hong Kong, we're very lucky in China, but you are very unlucky if you live in Gaza, for example. You'll be one of the most unlucky guys in the world. And which is why these are the questions which are being asked for the richest country in the world, and the world which controls the economy of the world, and who wants to keep it that way? But can they? That's the next question. Let me then come to the next piece of evidence. Now, the next piece of evidence is this, but before I come to the next piece of evidence, I'd like you to go to Karl Marx. Not that I studied him, because when I did my degree in PPE, that's politics, philosophy, and economics, I did that in Birmingham when I had a year off in 1971. And I was lucky enough to be able to go to Birmingham University. I was in a college which is associated to the university. I was able to do that. So I spent my whole year studying Karl Marx. But that was the thing, not known to my bosses, actually. I told them I studied economics and law, basically, which I did. I did study law, but most of the time I spent studying Karl Marx. I can say that now with without fear of any kind of result coming in. But I thought Karl Marx had a lot of logic behind him. But his main logic is this. He was at the end of his life saying to people, I am not a Marxist. He says this, why? He says that, well, the point is not about economic theory. The point is changing the world. This is what he said. That is engraved in his wave, in his gravestone. It's done in English because he was buried in Highgate Cemetery in London. If he were buried in Germany, then it'd be in German. But he was buried in Highgate Cemetery in London. And as a result, it is engraved in English. Now, changing the world, that's the question. Well, because of the financial crisis and so on, we've had a whole sort of slew of stuff about changing the world. But all of this is well known to you, the World Bank, the BIS with SDRs, Financial Stability Board, Basel 1, 2, and 3, and all that sort of stuff. Now, I'm not going to bore you with that, but that's the basic architecture. But this architecture does not, in fact, address the real problem. Now, this architecture, gives bankers and risk managers and people like me, chair of risk committees and so on, work to do, basically. Now, we have to do a hell of a lot of stuff to comply with that, but it does not, in fact, solve the basic problem. Why? Well, there's a problem with currencies, essentially. And the US dollar is definitely on the way down, which is why the US government is so scared at the moment. Because at the moment you see, the US dollar has historically been tied to gold. Then they tried to tie this to petroleum in 1974. Because all petroleum has to be bought and sold in US dollars. Now, gold's gone. Petroleum is about to go. And which is why. And the other thing is that the US bond yield is so high at the moment. And the Fed is now saying that, if we don't do something, there's going to be a recession. So we will have to begin to drop the interest rates. Now, with that, plus the Japanese saying to the US, why the hell do we want to prop up your currency when we're in trouble and you're adding trouble to me by sanctioning the Russians? So I'm going to increase some interest rates and we'll sell some bonds. Money will come back. So the US treasuries are in trouble. Now, but then the US treasury is in trouble, not only because of that, it is in trouble because of this very question. Now, this is a thing called the Trivium dilemma, which is a theory, which is a very, very simple theory. You can't have the best of all worlds. Essentially, you can't have your cake and eat it, essentially. If you want to have a free currency, you can only pick one or two policy objectives. You can't pick all three policy objectives. You can't have stability, basically. This is the very, very simple theory, essentially. And this is the Trivium dilemma. Now, because of this, we'll find that actually the US dollars have actually gone down in various countries. Even the exchange rates has gone up because of the US dollar increase in interest rates. But if you look at the money supply in the US, it has consistently gone up. Now, so you have an increase in money supply now with high interest rates, which is allowed to go down. You have treasuries issued in large quantities, then which is with an interest rate about to go down. Some of these with high yields because of low original coupon rates. And you have what people in the business would call a perfect storm, basically. Now, the IMF and the BIS has already published a paper, which it actually has called a perfect storm right now. Now, which is why if I were a policymaker in the Treasury, if I were Yellen, who understands all of this, I'd be pretty scared, basically. I'd be talking to my boss and say, don't be belligerent on this. Let's talk, try to get out of this. But then she doesn't have much say in terms of politics. I mean, she's the economics guy, basically. And as a result, you can see the problem then is this. Not only that the US dollar is losing its preeminence, but then the US budget is losing its preeminence. You see, the public debt held by the US now, the public debt, which is treasuries, has gone beyond 100% of the GDP. Right now, it's gone to be something like 100% of GDP, a little bit above 100%. But it is projected by the Peterson Institute that by 2030, if they go on the present path, the public debt will be over 200% of the GDP. But that's ridiculous, basically. Now, China's public debt is less than 40% of the GDP. It's got a lot of corporate debt. The corporate debt is tremendous, basically. But it's in the corporate sector, but not in the public sector right now. In the public sector, it's less than 40%. The US now exceeded 50%. Now, the other thing is why it has exceeded over 50% is because it has a structural deficit problem. And as I told you, it was Clinton who it was the only time that he was able to balance the budget. You can see, in fact, here the cross between between the blue line and the red line in here. That was the only time they balanced the budgets. Every time, in fact, they was in deficit. So we now have a structural deficit. In fact, now a baked-in structural deficit in the US budgeting system. Because of this, then why is this so? Because the US budget is based on two bits. The first bit are what is known as entitlements. In other words, the entitlements are Social Security, Medicare, and veterans. Those are entitlements, basically, which by law has to be given out. Now, of a $6 trillion annual budget, something like 3 trillion, more than 3 trillion, actually, a little bit more than 3 trillion goes into entitlements. Now, you just try cutting those entitlements. If you're a president, you'll be out of the door, basically, very quickly. And no president would dare to do this, basically. So therefore, we have 50% baked in. Okay, the next thing that's going to happen is something that you have to do, okay, is payment of interest on your public debt. Now, the payment of interest in the public debt at the moment is about 600 billion. Right now, it's about 600 billion. So you're talking about 3 trillion, some 600 billion, like 20%, it's like 10% of your whole budget, or 20% of your entitlements then goes into, but in fact, they are already, in fact, selling more US bonds. So in fact, very soon, by about 2025, the debt servicing would be something like 1 trillion US dollars. You just imagine having to pay 1 trillion, in fact, just for interest payments. Now, then that's the problem. And because of that, you have to shrink your discretionary spending. Now, but what is the discretionary spending? Now, you look at this at the moment, 6 trillion, 3 trillion goes to entitlements, another trillion goes to, you got 2 trillion left, right? If you got 2 trillion left, what are you going to do about those 2 trillion? Well, let me explain to you why those 2 trillion, basically, that you need to spend on. Let me just take you to this. Forget the healthcare, forget the life expectancy. Look at the discretionary spending. Now, this is the 2 trillion or the 1.7 trillion last year, okay? This year, 2023, we're about ending this year, so that was last year's budget, okay? 1.74 trillion. Look at the right-hand side, 45%. Okay, 0 minutes left, okay, right. 45% goes to defense. And this is going to increase, I can assure you, with the 2 wars going on. So they're going to squeeze the discretionary bit as much as possible. Talk about, Biden talks about giving assistance to housing, building infrastructure, and all that sort of thing. He needs more money from the Congress in order to do that. Will Congress give him more money? If he's given more money to do that, the deficit is going to be higher. But they are in a real situation at the moment. And you look at the way that they spend defense money, that is last year, 877 billion. The whole world, in fact, spends less than that. The whole world, actually. And that's going to be even more. So this is the position of the US. So let me then, since I have several minutes and I don't have time to conclude on it, let me then conclude on this. That what we have is the international rule-based order, which the US has created, and I think originally with lofty objectives. That has created, I think, what I would call the golden era of globalization. And it went to, I don't know, maybe something like the middle part, right up to the time of the global financial crisis. Right up to that time. I think that was because we enjoyed a period of 20 years of low interest rates, very rapid growth in business and trade, and also rapid growth in per capita GDP. Also, I think rapid growth in many countries, including China, of human development. You look at the Human Development Index, China has grown, in fact, quite a bit, in fact, over the years. And we were the beneficiaries, in fact, of globalization. We cannot deny that. Okay. unfortunate thing is that the US, having created that, felt that, well, you know, we have now created, in fact, monsters of our own making. That these are people who are going to, in fact, topple us from this position of rule making, which is because they were the people who created the rules, they were the people who interpreted the rules. It's going to topple us. If they topple us, the internal problems that we have created can't be perpetuated forever. We have to perpetuate that. Because they owe the world. They are the biggest creditor, debtor to the world. And they have want to keep it forever. They said now, the time of reckoning. When? And as a result, we have to delay that as much. Of course, the rest of the world is not stupid. The rest of the world sees that. As a result, in fact, we're finding, in fact, now different groupings around the world, which is American Alliance, Group 77, which is the Southern Hemisphere, the Middle Eastern countries are now saying that, well, you know, we're going to renege on the US dollar deal. Basically, we're going to accept rubles, we're going to accept Chinese currency, any kind of currency that you want. The other thing which is also happening is that the South American countries are saying to themselves, you know, gosh, you know, we have been slaves to the US since the 19th century. Argentina is saying that, Brazil is saying that, Belize, Colombia is saying that, all the small countries in South America. In order to break out, we say that, well, you know, how come our currency is like worth nothing compared to the US dollar? Currency is represented by the toils of our people, the value of our product, the value of our natural resources. How come, you know, it is worth nothing compared to the US dollars? Therefore, really, we must help realize that value out of a better system. Then we have China, or then we have Africa, saying that, how come that we only own 2% of the wealth of the world, when we have actually close to 80% of the net? That's ridiculous. How come the currency is worth nothing? How come a product is worth nothing? Why we have this problem? China is saying to the world, well, because of all of these problems, Marx says, workers of the world unite. We are workers. Let us.
Thank you, Tony, for your insights and sharing it. You know, for me, and I'm sure for all of you as well, you have enjoyed his lecture, and we've learned so much from him. Thank you very much for that. Right? Can I take this opportunity again to thank our event sponsors, BOC Hong Kong, as well as CICC, and also take this opportunity to invite them together with Susie and Tony for a quick photo. Great. Thank you once again. Thank you, Tony, for your insights. And just to quote Winston Churchill, difficulties mastered, opportunities won. So thank you very much for spending this time this afternoon with us, and wishing everyone a wonderful afternoon and also a great week ahead. And just to let you know that this event will be uploaded onto YouTube, so you can enjoy this at a later stage. And also, you know, to share this with your friends and colleagues as well. And just very quickly, a very quick, a little gift for Tony from us.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Oh, that's good. That's good. Thank you.